Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the start bench recommendations. I know this is getting out pretty much the last minute, but either way I figured I'd get this video out, give you guys a little bit of time to make your adjustments on it. We'll kick things off looking at Booty Basher. I think I only have recommendations for Booty, Mr. Steeler, Big Yawners, and Dictatorship. If your name wasn't mentioned there, there's really no recommendations for you, so I'm just going to move right on. To kick things off, we're going to take a look at Booty Basher, like I said. Booty, I recommend you start Josh Metellus in that you bench, Josh Sweat, and basically how you do that is you put Aaron Donald at the D line spot and then put Josh Metellus at the D spot. So the reason I'm saying to do this is Josh Sweat over these past few weeks has really been falling off. You can see the points for the most part. He's had almost a bad week every single week except for week 9 since week 8. He had the solid start of the season, but recently it just hasn't been looking very good. He has a tough matchup against Dallas. I overall am just not a fan of it. I think if anybody's going to do good in that game, I think it might be Hassan Reddick. But either way, I do think I prefer Hassan Reddick over Josh Sweat moving forward, and even though he's a linebacker. But yeah, I just don't really think it's smart to start Josh Sweat. You can just see the points difference between him and Josh Metellus. Um, and Josh Metellus overall has been a lot more consistent, especially over these past few weeks. And then last week I recommended that you start Brian Robinson and bench Jawan Johnson, the tight end for New Orleans. Brian Robinson got 5.3. Jawan Johnson got absolutely nothing, so this would have earned you an additional 5.3 points. And then I also recommended that you started Richie Grant and benched Aaron Donald. Richie Grant got 10.5. Aaron Donald got 12.25. This would have lost you about a point and a half, give or take. But overall, if you combined everything, you still would have got an additional 3.75 points. So it would have helped you overall if you would have listened to the advice. Then we'll move on to Mr. Steeler Girl. With Mr. Steeler Girl, I recommend that you start Zay Flowers and that you bench Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen, to say the absolute least over these past few weeks, has been struggling. He had those games with 10 points. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the games with 5, 1, 7.9. Sure, he's had a good season overall, but if you look at what he did against his previous week, or not against the previous week, but overall, I do think in the previous weeks he has been really struggling for the most part, and I do think this will probably be a tough matchup for him. He's probably going to go against Marshawn Lattimore. Granted, I said the same thing week 2, and they ended up putting Marshawn Lattimore on DJ Chark. But if Lattimore were to go up against Thielen, I think he could get as low as absolutely nothing. At least with Zay Flowers, he has been playing pretty consistently pretty much all season. He only had one bad game, and that was against Seattle. Other than that, he's been very good this season. I think he's a more reliable, more startable option here. And then I also recommend that you start Jordan Whitehead and you bench Deron Bland. I think Jordan Whitehead comes down to this too. He's going to be a lot more consistent than Deron Bland for this specific week. Jordan Whitehead, regardless of the matchup, usually finds a way to get around 10 points every single week, with the exception of week 5. You take a look at Deron Bland, and here's why I don't recommend starting him. And I think I've talked about this in a previous video. You notice a common trend with this guy when he plays against bad quarterbacks that make a lot of mistakes. That's the games when he really does good. Usually, like for example, against Daniel Jones, against Mac Jones, against Matthew Stafford playing through injuries, Bryce Young, Sam Howell, quarterbacks that just are known for making a lot of mistakes is when he's going in there and he's doing really good. But you'll notice against quarterbacks that are actually decent. So, for example, Brock Purdy, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts. You notice he doesn't really do nearly as good. He usually has tank games. So this is why I'd advise you bench Deron Bland. He's more of a mistake-free football player, and overall, I do think that it would probably be safer for you to start Jordan Whitehead. I'd be willing to bet that Jordan Whitehead will probably outplay Deron Bland this specific week. Then we'll take a look at Big Yawners. With Big Yawners, I recommend you start Kenny Moore and bench Hassan Reddick. Now, I know I said I think Hassan Reddick would be better um, than Josh Sweat, but either way, I do think if you look at Hassan Reddick, he has had a very similar thing happen to him throughout the season where he's really fallen off these past few weeks. It's hard to trust an edge rusher. He's going up against Dallas, who has a very good offensive line. I know they're not particularly known for having good tackles, but either way, they are looking like a very good offensive line. Hassan Reddick is looking like he's been pretty inconsistent to say the least over the past few weeks. And if you're big yawners, I just take the safe points with Kenny Moore. Kenny Moore has almost doubled Hassan Reddick's score on the year. He is always consistent with around 10 points each week. He has the insane upside just like Hassan Reddick. And overall, I just go with Kenny Moore. And on top of that, Kenny Moore is a slot corner, which means that he's known for sacks. He's known for shutting down running game. So overall, I do think I would prefer Kenny Moore here. And I think if you're big yawners, you know, especially the fact that the Bengals will probably be trying to get Joe Mixon involved in the game plan a lot, opening up a lot of opportunities for Kenny Moore to make plays. So I do think he'll be the better startable option. Then with Rictatorship, I recommend that you start Levante David and bench EJ Speed. It looks like you actually already did that, so never mind. I'll just move on. Um, then we'll look at the free agency side of things already. For the quarterback room, we'll kick things off. There's only two options, technically three, if you want to count Aaron Rodgers, but I don't really think there's a chance he's coming back realistically. The number one recommendation is Joe Flacco over Bailey Zappi because at least he has good weapons around him, such as Amari Cooper, and at least he has something to work with. And you saw it against the Rams where at least he was able to put up a good 23-point week. It's not a great option, but it's something, and it's better than Bailey Zappi. Bailey Zappi might be the better current quarterback, you could argue. However, he doesn't have Ramondre Stevenson, who's currently dealing with an injury. He has nobody to throw this ball to. Who does he have? Fucking Juju Smith-Schuster. Overall, the offense is just atrocious. He has no help. The offensive line sucks. And I would just prefer Joe Flacco all around. Now, with the running back room, I actually had two recommendations, one of which is already gone. Somebody already took them. And these were actually the pick of the week. So if you took either of these guys, I would have been willing to accept it as the prize winner. But lucky for you guys, he actually did get picked, so everybody's going to win. And it was actually Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jerick McChicken. For those of you who don't know, Chiefs running back Isaiah Pacheco is currently out, meaning the running back room is going to come down to these two. Now, in theory, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is probably going to be the main back, and he's probably going to be the guy that goes out there and gets most of the not targets, but most of the snaps, most of the plays, most of the opportunities to make shit happen. But if you actually look at the ending of last season with Jerick McKinnon, I wouldn't count him out in the sense of being able to outscore him. Jerick McKinnon for the second half of last season, I don't know how familiar you guys are with him. On a bad week, he would get 15 points, and he would usually get around something in the 20s. Just for his reception upside alone, he would finish games with upwards of 7+ catches per game. Am I promising that's going to happen this game? No, but he does have the upside to do it. He did it last season. And overall, I do think if you need a running back, this is the best chance you have at getting a solid running back pretty much all season off of free agency. And either way, props to Pussy for picking up Clyde Edwards-Helaire because that means I'm going to give everybody the $5 that participates usually in the event. Then we'll take a look at the wide receiver room. Once again, I'd recommend Josh Palmer to kick things off with. With Josh Palmer, we're pretty much just waiting for him to come back, and now there is a very good sign saying that he will be designated for return. Now, if you're in a position where you absolutely must win this week, don't worry about Josh Palmer. But if you can wait a few weeks for him to come back, you should have a solid guy. He's basically like a Michael Thomas, but with actual upside. He has Justin Herbert passing to him. In the games he played, he didn't get any less than 10 points in any of them, even against a tough Dallas defense. He was able to go out there, have some really good upside games, have some pretty solid weeks. And overall, he's probably the best option that'll be on free agent as long as he comes back. And the other guy I'd recommend is actually going to be Khalil Shakir for Buffalo. He's in a similar situation where he just has insane upside, so it's overall just best to try to get him over some of these other guys. These past few weeks, he's gotten at least 8 points in every week except for the week against Denver. And Denver has Pat Surtain, who's known for specifically shutting down slot receivers. But either way, Khalil Shakir has looked really good over these previous few weeks. I know he had a struggle at the start of the season, but it does seem like he's actively getting more and more involved in the offense. Now, maybe Dawson Knox can tank this a little bit in the sense of being bad, but either way, I do think it's probably better than anything on free agency, except for maybe Jahan Dotson, who's currently on a bye week. So maybe Jahan Dotson might replace him next week, depending on how well he plays this week. Then we'll move on to the tight ends, and you Bengals fans might be pretty happy to see that I actually have Tanner Hudson at my number one recommendation here. he's just been so consistent overall, whether it was with Joe Burrow, whether it was with Jake Browning. He's going out there and he's getting a good eight, 8 or so points per game every single week consistently. Overall, he's looking very consistent. This is what you want if you absolutely need a tight end off of free agency. And overall, I do think that I'm a pretty big fan of him. Maybe not as like the best tight end in the league, but at least he's being consistent. Then I'd also recommend Chikosium Okonkwo. With Chikosium Okonkwo, as funny as his name is, he's in a similar situation where for almost every game this season, with the exception of a few outliers, he has gotten at least around 6+ points per game. These past 2 weeks, he's gotten 9 points per game. It looks like Will Levis is starting to trust him a little bit more. So maybe keep an eye on him. He also has a very friendly few matchups moving forward. Now, when it comes to kicker, it's always hard to predict what the hell these guys are going to do, but I do recommend Will Lutz and Jason Myers respectively. Not this week for Jason Myers, but overall. With Will Lutz, we'll kick things off with him. With Will Lutz, or Will Lutz, I don't know why I keep calling Will Lutz. Will Lutz, I'm basically recommending him just because of his upside for the most part. He's found a way to be very consistent for the most part this season. Even when he has bad games, it's usually around 6+ points, so it's not horrible. And he also has some pretty solid upside, like I said, when he has 21 points, 17 points, 18 points. Overall, this is a Broncos team that's just been kicking a ton of field goals this season, and I am a pretty big fan of Will Lutz overall. So I do think he's a pretty solid option. And then the other guy I'd recommend is Jason Myers. Now, there is one thing concerning about him, and that's the fact that this week and week 15, he's playing against some very, very tough defenses. And I am not a fan of that, to say the least. But as you see there, he has been pretty consistent for the most part this season with a few bad games. Um, his main issue is that he is missing a lot of kicks, which is very concerning and could lose you fantasy points. But he's another guy that just has really good upside, so I'd recommend him. Um, then we'll take a look at the team defenses. And first of all, I'd recommend Jacksonville's team defense. This week they're playing against Cleveland that are using backup running backs. Amari Cooper's dealing with an injury. They're missing their left tackle. They're missing their starting quarterback. What else are they missing? Their fucking tight end burnt half his face off. Everywhere you look, this offense is just beat to hell and back. Now maybe they're still a strong offense because they always find a way to put up 30 points somehow, but either way, their team is just beat to hell and back. This is a very strong Jacksonville defense that has done pretty solid for the most part this season. Outside of that game against Jake Browning, that looked bad, but either way, they held the Titans to 14. They held the Steelers to 10. This has been a very solid Jacksonville defense all around the board, holding teams like the Chiefs to 17. I would recommend taking a look at them because this is probably the best matchup they've had all season, so I think they have a good chance of blowing up. And then moving forward for the rest of the season, this is going to come as a big shocker to you guys, but I'm actually going to go with Chicago. Now, with Chicago, you see the beginning of the year, you're like, man, those guys fucking suck. And I agree, as a Bears fan, they do fucking suck. But you can look at the end point of the season, these last few games. They had 5 interceptions against the Vikings. They did pretty solid against Detroit, even though they let up 31 points. Most of that was at the ending of the game when they choked the entire game. But either way, they have looked very solid over these past 3 weeks, to say the least, outside of Detroit, who is one of the best offenses in the entire league. And even then, they're getting quite a few sacks. They're getting quite a few interceptions. They're getting tackles for losses. You name it. They're doing it for the most part. And I'm not saying to start them this week, but look at that playoff schedule moving forward. They play against the shitty Arizona offense, the shitty Atlanta offense, and they play against this Browns team that are just beat to hell and back. I think they might have a chance to score a lot of fantasy points in these upcoming weeks, and I think they could be one of the more underrated players you could use when it comes to the defensive spot. But either way, I think that's a long-term recommendation I think you guys might like. Then we'll move to the DB spot. To kick things off with the DB spot, I actually think I'm going to recommend Devon Witherspoon as my first pick. He's been one of the highest scoring DBs in all of, fantasy. And I was actually surprised somebody cut him. Week 1, he didn't do anything because I don't think he started. Since then, he's had almost every single week this season with at least 8 points, with some games with really good upside. He seems like a very solid option. He had that bad game against Cleveland, but other than that, every single week he's showing consistency. He's getting a lot of tackles. He's making sacks happen. He's making interceptions happen. He's pretty much doing everything around the board, and he is looking like a very solid option. and I do think he's probably the best option in terms of the DBs right now on free agency. Then the other guy I'd recommend is actually going to be PJ Locke for Denver. He's replacing Kareem Jackson, who got suspended for, well, doing a bunch of stupid shit. But, well, I don't even want to say it's stupid shit. He was basically just playing football for a lot of it, but he definitely did have some targeting issues. Um, and with PJ Locke, you see it there, 24 and a half. He's currently played 2 games without Kareem Jackson where he was replacing him. And you can see the score for yourself, gentlemen. 20 and a half, 24 and a half. He's getting at least 7 tackles. He's had a sack in both games. Am I saying he's for sure going to go out there and keep doing this? No. But he does have some really good upside overall as it is. And I do think he does seem like he could be a really high end player that could come up clutch for quite a few teams that need a good player. And overall, he does seem like a pretty solid option so far. No reason not to trust him, as of yet at least. Then we'll take a look at the D line. With the D line, I think this one was pretty obvious. We'll take a look at the guys who've scored the most points. I'm not even going to recommend Aiden Hutchinson. We'll take a look at Danico Autry, by far the best option on free agency. There's only one guy that's close, and we'll talk about him in a second. In terms of the points, he's pretty much shooting everything out of the water, if that's the right term for it, blowing everything out of the water. But overall, he has been really good for the most part this season. He's had some inconsistency to say the least, but he, for the most part, is finding ways to have really good upsided games and do pretty well. And then we'll actually talk about Ed Oliver as the second option. I know he has less points than most of the other options at the top there, but remember, he did miss 2 weeks. He did play a few weeks through injury, and he did get hurt early in one of the games. So remember that. He could be way better than he was. My guess is if he played all that time, healthy overall, he probably would have been just up there with some of the better scoring defensive linemen in all of fantasy. I'd say he's startable for pretty much anybody. He's done really good this season, showing some really good, solid consistency. Only one bad week so far. Overall, I think he's a very good option. I think a lot of people could use him. Then we'll take a look at the linebackers. There's actually 2 guys that I'd say are actually pretty solid options at this point. The first of all being David Long. For those of you who don't know, Jerome Baker actually got sent to the injured reserve list. So if you're Karen's husband, that doesn't necessarily mean panic or anything like that. What you can do is you can actually turn around. You can see that they have David Long right here. And David Long is probably going to go back to the ways he did from weeks 2 to week 6. He's probably going to go out there, have some pretty solid upside. You saw it week 13 where he had 16 points. He's probably going to go out there, be very consistent. He'll probably be one of the better linebackers in pretty much all of, maybe not all of fantasy, but at least the best one in all of free agency, to say the least. And overall, I do think he's going to be a very good option, a very consistent option moving forward. He'll be a tackle machine if I had to guess. And I think anybody who needs a linebacker could really use David Long. And then I'd also recommend Cody Barton. Cody Barton isn't nearly as good as David Long, I don't think, but he is going to be relatively consistent. He has done pretty solid for the most part this season outside of week 1, and he did get hurt week 7. But overall, I do think he does have the consistency valve to justify putting him here. He's probably going to get at least 13 points each week. He's a solid option. His only issue is that in real life, he kind of sucks, so he could get benched at any point. But either way, he is a pretty solid option from a solid fantasy side of things. And I do think that he'll probably be the second best linebacker you can get out here. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys later.